Imagine this. It's the year 2025. Russian forces are massing on the borders of Eastern Europe. China is expanding its influence across the globe. NATO, once the backbone of Western security, stands on the brink of collapse. And the reason? The United States might walk away. For over 75 years, NATO has been the world's most powerful military alliance. It stopped the Soviet Union, deterred Russian aggression, and kept Europe safe. But now, under Donald Trump's second term, the U.S. is questioning everything. Why should America keep defending Europe if Europe won't defend itself? And here's where things get dangerous. If the U.S. actually pulls out of NATO, the consequences will be instant. Russia could make its next move. European countries might be left scrambling. China, watching closely, ready to step in. The balance of global power would shift overnight, and the world as we know it would change forever. So, is NATO doomed? Is Trump serious about pulling out? And if he does, what happens next? Stick with me, because what you're about to hear might shock you. Chapter 1. The U.S.-NATO marriage was never perfect. To understand NATO's uncertain future, we have to go back to how it started. It was 1949. World War II had left Europe in ruins, and the Soviet Union was expanding its influence, tightening its grip on Eastern Europe. The fear of another war, this time between the U.S. and the USSR, was growing. So, the United States and 11 other nations came together to form NATO, a military alliance built on one simple promise. An attack on one is an attack on all. But here's the part that often gets overlooked. The U.S. never signed up to be Europe's sole defender. From the beginning, there was a deal. America would provide security, but Europe had to invest in its own defense. And yet, year after year, the numbers told a different story. The U.S. kept spending, while some of its allies barely contributed. Take Germany, for example. Today, it has the largest economy in Europe. Yet for decades, it failed to meet the NATO defense spending target of 2% of GDP. At one point, Germany's defense budget was so low that in military exercises, their soldiers had to use broomsticks instead of actual rifles because they didn't have enough weapons. It's not just Germany. Belgium, Spain, and Italy also consistently lagged behind, while the U.S. continued to foot the bill. By 2024, the numbers were staggering. America was spending over $860 billion on defense, while some NATO members barely contributed a fraction of that. And this is where the tension starts boiling over. For decades, the U.S. maintained military bases across Europe, spending billions on troop deployments, nuclear deterrence, and high-tech defense systems. Meanwhile, many European nations cut their military budgets, closed bases, and relied on American protection as if it was a permanent security blanket. And now, under President Trump's leadership, that security blanket is being pulled away. The U.S. is no longer just questioning NATO's purpose. It's questioning whether the alliance should even exist at all. Chapter 2. The Trump Effect, NATO's Breaking Point. Let's be clear. Donald Trump has never been a fan of NATO. Even before his presidency, he called it obsolete. He argued that the alliance was a relic of the Cold War, a system that unfairly burdened the U.S. while letting other countries off the hook. And now, under his second term, Trump is doubling down on that stance. His administration has already cut U.S. military funding for NATO operations and is pulling troops out of European bases at an unprecedented rate. The White House's new policy is simple: America first, NATO second. But here's where things get even more explosive. Trump has reportedly told close advisors that if European nations don't pay their fair share, he's ready to pull the U.S. out of NATO entirely. Think about that for a second. The United States, the backbone of NATO, the country that has kept Europe safe for over 75 years, could walk away from the alliance completely. And while some dismiss this as political posturing, the numbers tell a different story. The latest data shows that even after years of warnings, only 11 out of NATO's 31 member states are meeting their defense spending commitments. Germany, despite promises to increase its budget, is still falling short. France, which claims to support a stronger European military, is barely meeting the minimum threshold. Meanwhile, the U.S. continues to station over 100,000 troops in Europe, covering the cost of military bases, nuclear deterrence, and advanced air defense systems, all while American taxpayers foot the bill. And now, Trump is asking the question that has been whispered in Washington for years but never spoken aloud with such force. Why should America keep defending Europe if Europe won't defend itself? If the US does leave NATO, the consequences could be catastrophic. Russia has been watching closely. Vladimir Putin has long seen NATO as a roadblock to Russian expansion, and if the alliance weakens, Moscow could see an opportunity to test the waters, whether in Eastern Europe, the Baltics, or even beyond. China, too, is watching. If NATO crumbles, it could signal a decline. Chapter 3. What if the US leaves NATO? Here's where things get serious. The moment the US withdraws from NATO, the balance of global power shifts overnight. It's not just a question of whether NATO can survive. It's about what fills the vacuum left behind. And history has shown us one undeniable truth. When a superpower retreats, another steps in. Without American troops stationed across Europe, the entire eastern flank of NATO, Poland, the Baltics, and even Finland becomes exposed to the full force of Russian military power. Right now, Russia has nearly 1.1 million active military personnel and over 12,000 tanks. More than any NATO member other than the US, Moscow has already demonstrated its willingness to push boundaries, from Georgia in 2008 to Crimea in 2014, to its ongoing war in Ukraine. If NATO fractures, the question isn't if Russia will test the alliance's limits, but where and how fast. But while Russia strengthens its grip on Eastern Europe, another silent player emerges on the global chessboard: China. The US stepping back from NATO doesn't just mean a military vacuum, it also creates an economic and diplomatic one. With Europe looking for alternative security and trade arrangements, China is perfectly positioned to expand influence. Beijing has already invested over $300 billion into European infrastructure through its Belt and Road Initiative, buying ports, telecom networks, and energy companies. If NATO collapses, China could become Europe's new strategic partner, offering economic deals in exchange for political leverage. And then there's Europe itself. For decades, European leaders have talked about forming their own independent military force, but without American intelligence, technology, and funding, can they actually pull it off? The EU combined may be an economic giant, but militarily, it's fragmented. Germany, the largest economy in Europe, still struggles to field a fully operational tank brigade due to years of military neglect. France may have nuclear weapons, but without US satellite intelligence and logistical support, its global strike capability is severely limited. So here's the hard truth. If NATO breaks down, Europe isn't just left without a military umbrella, it's left scrambling to build a new one from scratch. And in the chaos, Russia and China won't wait. Chapter 4. Europe's wake-up call. Can they step up? As the US questions its commitment to NATO, Europe is faced with a harsh reality. It's time to take responsibility for its own defense. For decades, European nations have relied on American military might to protect them from external threats. But with the US reevaluating its role in NATO, Europe must now confront the possibility of standing alone. Some European countries, like Poland and the UK, are taking proactive steps to bolster their military capabilities. Poland, for instance, has pledged to increase its defense spending to 4% of GDP, a significant commitment that demonstrates its willingness to take defense seriously. Similarly, the UK has announced plans to boost its military budget and enhance its strategic partnerships with other European nations. However, not all European countries are following suit. Germany, Europe's largest economy, is still struggling to meet its defense commitments. Despite promises to increase its military spending, Germany's defense budget remains woefully inadequate, leaving its military ill-equipped to respond to emerging threats. The disconnect between European nations' defense commitments and their actual spending is staggering. Only a handful of NATO members meet the 2% GDP defense spending target, a benchmark that's been in place for years. This lack of investment in defense has left Europe vulnerable to external threats and reliant on American military power. As the US reconsiders its role in NATO, Europe must confront the consequences of its own inaction. Will European nations finally step up and take responsibility for their own defense? Or will they continue to rely on American military might, even as the US signals its intention to pull back? The answer to this question will have far-reaching implications for European security, global stability, and the future of NATO itself. Chapter 5. What happens next? So where do we go from here? The question of whether the U.S. will actually leave NATO isn't just about politics, it's about strategy. Some believe Trump's threats are just a negotiation tactic, a way to pressure European allies into finally paying their fair share. But others warn that his stance on NATO is unlike any other U.S. president in history. Right now, NATO is at a breaking point. The U.S. contributes about 70% of NATO's total military budget. Without that funding, the alliance as we know it collapses. European leaders are scrambling to reassure Washington that they are stepping up, but the numbers tell a different story. Less than half of NATO's 31 members meet the 2% GDP defense spending target. Even after years of pressure, some of Europe's wealthiest nations still hesitate to build real military capabilities. And if the U.S. actually pulls out, expect a new geopolitical era. One where Russia pushes deeper into former Soviet territories. One where China tightens its grip on global trade routes. One where Europe faces a hard reality that without the U.S., it must either stand together or fall apart. For decades, NATO has been the glue holding the West together. But as American foreign policy shifts, we may be witnessing the moment where that glue starts to crack. The question is, will anyone be able to stop it? Summary and conclusions. The future of NATO is uncertain. The U.S. is questioning its role in the alliance, and the consequences of a potential withdrawal are dire. For decades, European nations have relied on American military might, but now they must take responsibility for their own defense. The numbers are stark. Only a handful of NATO members meet the 2% GDP defense spending target. So, what's next? The U.S. contributes about 70% of NATO's total military budget. Without that funding, the alliance as we know it collapses. European leaders must step up and take responsibility for their own defense. The question is, will they? If not, expect a new geopolitical era where Russia and China fill the power vacuum. The future of NATO and global security hangs in the balance.